Hi there. Let's take a look at some key quotes from Act 2, starting with quotes from Sheila. Sheila says, "I'm afraid you'll say something or do something you'll be sorry for afterwards." At this point, Sheila understands the inspector's role in the story. She tries to warn her mother that the inspector knows more than he seems to. She knows that Inspector Gould is giving each character the rope to hang themselves with. He is letting them explore their own involvement and work out their own guilt. We really must stop these silly pretences. Sheila quickly becomes the mature voice of reason, the person who influences others to act sensibly. She knows that the inspector already knows how every member of the family was involved with Eva Smith. She tries to get her family to just play along and tell the truth. This could also link to the idea that these upper-class people cared so much about presenting perfect personas, they never presented their true selves to anyone. Priestley, through Sheila, tells these upper-class people that they need to care less about social appearances and more about the consequences of their actions. You and I aren't the same people who sat down to dinner here. Sheila shows a great deal of emotional maturity. She breaks her engagement because she realises she does not really know her fiancé. Although she had said many sarcastic, harsh comments to Gerald during his interrogation, made his questioning, she does not hate him, but she feels she cannot commit to spending her life with a man she does not know. She is not worried about losing a close business connection, unlike her father. What does this quote show Sheila has realised? "I'm afraid you'll say something or do something that you'll be sorry for after." This is that she knows the infected is letting them explore their own involvement in Eva's suicide and work out their own guilt. Some key quotes from Sheila in Act 2 are, I'm afraid you'll say something or do something that you'll be sorry for afterwards. We really must stop these silly pretences. You and I aren't the same people who sat down to dinner here." Now let's have a look at some key quotes from Inspector Gould. Inspector Gould says this key quote in Act 2, "Public men, Mr. Birling, have their responsibilities as well as their privileges. The message is the message to the wider British society in 1946. During his time fighting in World War II, Priestley saw soldiers being sent off to die for their country. Upper-class generals and leaders stayed in safe places. They didn't fear for their own lives, but sent their social inferiors, those of the lower class, into battle. This made him feel very angry at the class system." In this quote, Gould wants to make it clear that although upper-class men are free to enjoy the benefits of their lifestyle, they must also be responsible members of society who care about the lower-class people who make the upper-class lifestyles possible. The quote from Inspector Gould is that public men, Mr. Birling, have their responsibilities as well as their privileges. And although upper-class men are free to enjoy the benefits of their lifestyle, they must also be responsible members of society who care about the lower-class people. Now let's look at some key quotes from Mrs. Birling in Act 2. She says, "Go and look for the father of the child. It's his responsibility." As soon as Mrs. Birling finds out that Eva was pregnant, she shifts all the blame onto the father of the child. As this man is described, dramatic irony, when the audience knows something the characters don't, unfolds as the audience realise that this man is actually Eric, Mrs. Birling's son. As Mrs. Birling continues her speech, the audience waits for her to work out that she is actively criticising her own son. As long as this man is anonymous, meaning he's not named, she does not care what happens to him. When she starts to realise it could be her son, she stutters and stops talking. "You seem to have made a great impression on this child." Mrs. Birling is talking to Inspector Gould. She shows she doesn't respect Sheila as a young adult. She still thinks of her as a child and talks about her as if she was not in the room. She also belittles the effect the inspector has had. She suggests that this impression will be short-lived and that Sheila will not be permanently affected by him. You know, of course, that my husband was Lord Mayor only 2 years ago and that he's still a magistrate. This highlights the influence of the upper classes. Most people would let the Birlings be treated differently and receive special treatment. Both Mr. and Mrs. Birling find it unacceptable that Inspector Gould refuses to worship or fear them. Priestley uses their attitudes to show the corruption, which means the moral wrongness in a society that lets social classes be treated differently, and in some cases not even be included in criminal investigations purely because of their social class. "It's you, and not the inspector." This exclamation from Mrs. Birling to Sheila shows a crack in their apparently perfect family facade, meaning fake image. The family members have begun to separate. They verbally attack one another, suggesting that a perfect family is not so perfect after all. She only had herself to blame. Mrs. Birling says that many times that Eva Smith was to blame for her own fate and for the charity refusing to help her. She then goes on to blame the man that got Eva pregnant. At no point in the whole play does Mrs. Birling accept any responsibility for her own actions or think that her actions may have negative consequences for others. She doesn't understand that she's to think about other people. Mrs. Birling only cares about her own family, how they look to other people, and keeping or improving their social standing. So let's do a quick analysis of a key quote from Mrs. Birling in Act 2. She says, "You seem to have made a great impression on this child." Impression, which kind of conjures the images that belittles the effect the inspector has had, and suggests that this impression will be short-lived and that Sheila will not be permanently affected by him. She also says the word child, showing she doesn't respect Sheila as a young adult, and that she thinks of her as a child and talks about her as if she is not in the room. So the key quotes from Mrs. Birling in Act 2 are, "She only had herself to blame. You seem to have made a great impression on this child. Go and look for the father of the child. It's his responsibility, and it's you, not the inspector. We really must stop these silly pretences." And now this is something said by Sheila in Act 2. It's a message to the upper classes, showing that they need to care less about social appearances and more about the consequences of their actions. Through this quote, she becomes a mature voice of reason. She knows the inspector already knows how every member of the family was involved with Eva Smith, and tries to get her family just to play along and tell the truth. Let's quickly recap Priestley's anger. During his time fighting in World War II, Priestley saw soldiers being sent off to die for their country, but upper-class generals and leaders stayed in safe places. They didn't fear for their own lives, but sent their social inferiors into battle, which made him feel very angry at the class system. Now here's a key quote from Mrs. Birling. Let's just analyse this. She says, "You know, of course, that my husband was Lord Mayor only 2 years ago and that he's still a magistrate. This shows corruption. Society lets the social classes be treated differently. And it also shows the influence of the upper classes. Most people would let the Birlings be treated differently. Mr. and Mrs. Birling find it unacceptable that Inspector Gould refuses to worship or fear them." What is Sheila doing in this quote from Act 2? She says, "You and I aren't the same people who sat down to dinner here." Is she ending her engagement to Gerald? Is she telling her parents how different they are because they won't accept responsibility? Or is she announcing that she's decided to become a vegetarian? The correct answer is that she is ending her engagement to Gerald. What message is Priestley trying to give the wider British society with this quote from Inspector Gould? He says, "Public men, Mr. Birling, have their responsibilities as well as their privileges." So Inspector Gould says this to Mr. Birling. What he's trying to say is upper class men must be responsible members of society who care about lower class people. What are the key quotes said by Mrs. Birling in Act 2? "You seem to have made a great impression on this child. You know, of course, that my husband was Lord Mayor only 2 years ago and he's still a magistrate. It's you and not the inspector. She only had herself to blame. Go and look for the father of the child. It's his responsibility."